My name is Darren. I was 33 years old when this happened. It was the fall of 2017, and I had just left my job at a construction supply company in Spokane, Washington. I needed a break from people. My head was a mess from dealing with back-to-back stress at work, and I had just gotten out of a 6-year relationship that ended badly. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to see anyone. I needed silence, space, and maybe a little time out in the woods to shake the noise loose from my head. That's when my cousin Nathan texted me. He had this cabin he built himself a few years earlier on his wife's family's old farmland. It was somewhere near Grangeville, Idaho, remote enough that you had to drive 15 miles on gravel roads just to reach the main road. He used it for hunting during the season, but it was empty most of the year. He said I could stay as long as I wanted. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, and no running water. Just a generator, a big old water tank, and a whole lot of trees. Sounded perfect. I packed up my old 2005 Toyota Tacoma, loaded up some canned food, dried goods, a water jug, and my 12-gauge pump shotgun. Not because I was scared, but because there are mountain lions and bears in Idaho, and it never hurts to be cautious when you're alone. I also brought some books, my journal, and a solar charger for my flashlight and small radio. No cell signal meant no calls, which was fine by me. I was tired of my phone anyway. The drive took me about 7 hours. I left Spokane just after sunrise and pulled into the overgrown gravel path to the cabin around 3 in the afternoon. The sky was a bright, cold blue. The air smelled like pine and dry leaves. It felt like I had driven straight out of the world and into nowhere. The cabin was small but solid, with a tin roof and wide porch. A woodpile was stacked neatly against the side wall, and an axe was buried in a splitting stump nearby. I parked by the porch and walked the perimeter of the cabin before going inside. Everything looked normal. There was a little shed off to the side, probably 30 yards from the cabin, built from old gray boards and leaning slightly to one side. I peeked inside and found a bunch of rusted tools, an old bicycle frame, and a few bales of hay. The wind rustled the weeds around the shed, and I suddenly realized how quiet everything was.
No engines.
No traffic, no people, just the wind and the dry whisper of tall grass. Inside the cabin was exactly what I expected. One room, with stove in the corner, a cot with a rolled-up sleeping bag, a couple of shelves filled with food cans, beans, rice, and oats. There was a small generator behind the cabin, which ran off a tank of gas Nathan left for me. I tested it out that evening and it worked fine. I didn't plan to use it much, but it was good to know it was there. I spent that first night reading by flashlight and listening to the wind outside. It got cold fast. I slept in my clothes. The next day I explored a little. There were no other houses anywhere nearby, just tree lines and long stretches of dry field that looked like they hadn't been plowed in decades. There was an old barbed wire fence running through the edge of the woods, and a couple of metal signs so rusted you couldn't read them anymore. One looked like it might have said "No trespassing," but it was barely more than orange rust. The first couple days went by peacefully. I read, chopped some wood, cleaned out the stove, and wrote in my journal. My head started to feel clearer. Being out there in the silence made me feel like I was floating in time. But things started to feel strange on the third night. It started with the generator. I had only used it once, but on that third evening I walked around to check on it just before dark. The gas can had been moved. It had definitely been sitting flush against the wall when I arrived, but now it was a few feet away and tipped on its side. I thought maybe an animal had bumped it, but there were no bite marks, no tracks. I didn't think too much of it, but I did take it inside that night just to be safe. Then, right around midnight, I heard something outside. It was a sharp metal clank, like someone had dropped a tool onto the woodpile. I sat up and waited. Nothing happened for several minutes, just wind. Then another sound, a soft scrape against the side of the cabin, low to the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and my shotgun and quietly stepped over to the door. I didn't open it. I just listened. The sound didn't come again. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin and didn't see anything unusual.
No prints. No scratches.
But there was one thing that stuck with me. The shed door was slightly open. I knew I had shut it. It creaked so badly that you can't move it without hearing it, and I was sure I would have noticed if the wind had swung it open. I closed it again and jammed a broken shovel handle through the metal loop to keep it shut. On the fourth night, I was already on edge. I didn't use the generator at all that evening, and I went to bed early. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see across the clearing outside the window. Around 2 in the morning, I was woken up by a crunching sound, dry grass being stepped on. Slow and steady, not an animal. It was too heavy, and it circled the cabin. I sat there in the dark, gripping the shotgun, breathing as quietly as I could. The steps stopped by the porch. Then I heard 3 short knocks. Tap, tap, tap on the wall. Not the door, the wall. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just waited. I must have sat there frozen for an hour. When daylight finally started to creep in through the window, I got up and checked the porch. Nothing.
No prints. No marks.
No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. The next day, I didn't do much. I stayed close to the cabin and kept the shotgun near me at all times. I didn't even go to the shed. I just kept scanning the tree line, looking for movement. I kept thinking maybe it was someone messing with me, maybe some drifter or hunter. But who would be out here that deep with no vehicle and no supplies? It made no sense. That night was the worst. It started with a faint sound of breathing outside the window near the cot. I thought I was imagining it until I moved the blanket and the breathing stopped instantly, like someone heard me and ducked away. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on quickly, and shone it out the window. Just trees, nothing else. But when I stepped out with the light and swept it toward the shed, I saw something that stopped me cold. The shed door was wide open again, and this time the shovel handle I had jammed through the loop was lying in the dirt 5 feet away, snapped in half. I didn't go near it. I turned and went back inside, locked the door, and pushed the wood stove in front of it. It was heavy and awkward, but I wasn't taking chances. I stayed up all night again, and this time I kept the flashlight off. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. The silence was so thick it made my ears ring. Just before dawn, I heard movement again. This time it was faster. Someone running, circling the cabin once, then stopping. Then I heard something hit the wall near the back. Not a knock, something thrown. Thudded against the boards, then dropped. I waited for the sun. When I finally stepped out, I found what they threw. It was a can of beans from the shelf inside the shed. Someone had been inside again. And then I saw the footprints. Not boot tracks, bare feet. Big, wide, bare human footprints in the dirt and dry grass around the cabin. They weren't fresh. Looked like they had been made overnight, but they were clear. I followed them about 20 yards into the trees before they just stopped. No turn.
No deeper prints.
Like whoever made them just vanished. I didn't stay a 7th night. That morning I packed everything back into the truck and drove out without eating breakfast. The whole drive back to Spokane, I kept checking my mirrors. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched. Not by ghosts or anything like that. Just someone who had been out there, someone who maybe lived out there, deep in those woods, watching me from the moment I arrived. I told Nathan when I got back. He didn't believe me, but he said I looked like I hadn't slept in days. He went back out the next weekend and said the shed door was closed, and nothing was out of place. I think whoever it was only came around because I was there. It's been years now, and I still think about it. Not because I'm afraid, but because I keep wondering what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. What if I had gone into that shed when the door was open? What if I had opened the cabin door when I heard those knocks? I still have the journal from that week. Sometimes I read the entries just to remind myself that it happened, that it was real, not a dream, not paranoia, just a man alone in the woods, being watched by someone who didn't want him there. I haven't gone back to that cabin since, and I never will. I hadn't been back to the cabin since the divorce, not once in nearly 9 years. It sat tucked away in a patch of forest near Lake Wilbraham, about 20 minutes outside a small town in northern Minnesota. Jack had bought it back in 2006 when we were still married. He wanted something quiet, something far from the noise of city life, and I had gone along with it even though I was more comfortable around sidewalks and neighbors. When the lawyer called in September to tell me Jack had passed from a heart attack and that I was listed as the secondary beneficiary for the cabin in his will, I didn't feel much. We'd split in 2014, and our lives had gone in totally different directions. I was now 42, working full-time at a dental office in Duluth, living alone. No kids, no contact with Jack in years. I wasn't even sure if he had remarried. The cabin was now mine, just like that. At first, I thought I'd sell it, but something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the guilt I didn't want to admit I felt. Or maybe it was something else, just a need to see it again before I handed it off to a realtor and never looked back. So, I took a week off work in early October and made the 3-hour drive up north in my Subaru. I told no one where I was going. I didn't even tell my sister. I just packed a bag, printed the property deed, and left before the sun came up. The drive was mostly quiet, except for the occasional fog that clung to the road as I got closer to the lake. The leaves had already started turning, reds and oranges smudged into the gray sky. When I finally turned off onto the gravel road that led into the woods, my stomach knotted up. The path was narrower than I remembered, probably because the trees had grown in over the years. A few branches scraped across my windshield, and I flinched each time. Felt like the woods didn't want me back. The cabin looked exactly the same when I pulled up. Wooden frame darkened by time and weather, the tin roof streaked with rust, the porch sagging just a little more than it used to. One of the side windows had a crack in it, but other than that, everything looked untouched. No sign of forced entry.
No graffiti.
No broken furniture tossed outside. I unlocked the front door with the key Jack had left in a small lockbox mounted on a tree near the steps. The inside smelled like old firewood and dust. I stood in the center of the main room and just let it sink in. The same wood stove sat in the corner, and the couch we'd bought together still had the tear in the left cushion. A few beer bottles lined the windowsill. The small table near the kitchen was covered in dust, and a thick book sat open like someone had just been reading it. I didn't cry or break down. I just felt weird, disconnected, like I was stepping into a life I didn't recognize anymore. But I wasn't scared. Not yet. Not that day. I spent the afternoon sweeping and airing the place out. I opened all the windows and let the cool October air in. I found a few of Jack's things in the bedroom drawers. A few shirts, an old flashlight, a pack of cigarettes. I didn't throw anything away. I just folded it all back up and left it alone. By late evening, I had unpacked my stuff into the spare bedroom. I had no real plan for how long I'd stay. Maybe a night, maybe a few. I figured I'd see how I felt. Around 7, I cooked some scrambled eggs and toast on the little propane stove, then sat outside on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The trees were silent except for the wind, and once in a while I heard the lake pushing against the rocks about 50 yards away. That night I didn't sleep much, not because of fear, just because the bed was stiff and the silence was deeper than what I was used to. At home, there was always some background noise. A fridge humming, traffic outside, a neighbor's dog barking. Out here, it was like the world had stopped. The next morning, I woke up around 6 and went for a short walk. There was an old path behind the cabin that led to the lake, and I followed it through the trees. The ground was damp, and I slipped once, catching myself on a branch. I passed an old fire pit and a bench Jack had built out of scrap wood. I stopped there for a while and just looked out at the lake. It was calm, barely moving, and the sun hadn't fully broken through the clouds yet. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The back door, the one that led out to the small woodshed, was open. Just slightly. I hadn't gone out that way, and I knew I hadn't left it open. But it wasn't kicked in, and nothing seemed broken. I walked out onto the back steps and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. The woodshed door was closed, and the axe we used to keep propped by the wall was still there. I chalked it up to the wind and made a mental note to close it tighter next time. But something didn't feel right after that. Over the next couple of days, small things kept bothering me. On the second night, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch around midnight. I froze in bed, listening. They were slow, heavy. Not an animal, not a raccoon or deer. They stopped after a minute. When I got up and looked through the front window, no one was there. I even stepped outside with a flashlight. The trees were still, and I couldn't see anything past the edge of the clearing. The next morning, I found fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch.
Footprints.
Not mine. They were deeper, wider. I didn't know what to make of it. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. There weren't even other cabins nearby. I tried to convince myself it was an old print from before, but I knew it wasn't. The dirt had been soaked from rain the day before. These were new. I kept going through Jack's things. I found a small, rusted lockbox under the bed. It wasn't locked. Inside were papers, mostly receipts, maps, a few photos. But one thing stood out. It was a torn notebook, the kind he used to write in when we were married. The first few pages were grocery lists and maintenance notes. Then further in, the writing got strange. It looked like he'd started documenting things he was hearing. Things he thought were happening around the cabin. Scratching on the roof. Movement in the woods at night. The way animals avoided the clearing. He even drew a rough sketch of what looked like a person, standing at the tree line, staring at the cabin. The figure was tall, bulky, and faceless. Jack had written the date next to it, April 18th, 2023. That wasn't long before he died. My stomach dropped. Was he being paranoid? Had he seen someone out here? Couldn't tell. The entries stopped abruptly after that date. On the fourth night, I couldn't sleep again. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the crunch of leaves just outside my window. It was slow, steady. I got up, heart pounding, and peered through the blinds. There was someone standing near the woodshed. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes, not moving, just watching. I ducked back and grabbed my phone, but of course, there was no service. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run to the car, but I didn't even have the keys on me. I crouched by the window for nearly 20 minutes. When I looked again, he was gone. The next morning, I found the side of the woodshed had been scratched. Deep gouges across the wood like someone had dragged a metal tool across it, and the axe was missing. That was the last straw. I packed my things. I was done. I loaded everything into the car by noon and did one final sweep of the cabin. When I locked the front door and stepped off the porch, I stopped. In the dirt near my tire tracks were boot prints again. The same kind, but this time there were more of them, like someone had been circling the cabin overnight. I didn't look back as I drove away. I just kept my eyes on the road until I reached the highway. I didn't report anything. I didn't go to the police. I didn't tell anyone. I got back to my apartment and stayed inside for 2 days. Eventually, I reached out to a realtor and started the process of selling the cabin. But a week later, I got an email from the realtor. He said when he went to visit the property for the listing photos, the front door was wide open. The lock was broken. Inside, furniture had been moved, and the bedroom mattress was slashed open. He asked if I had left it that way. I told him no. I told him I hadn't been back since I left. He didn't push the issue. He just told me someone had likely been squatting there and that we'd need to clean it up before listing. I told him to do whatever he needed to do. I wanted it gone. I wanted it over with. The sale went through a month later. I signed the papers and I never went back. I still think about it sometimes. About Jack, about what he saw out there, what might have been going on in those woods that none of us ever knew about. I don't know if he was losing his mind or if someone really had been watching him. All I know is he was scared, and by the time I left that place, I was too. There's nothing else tying me to that cabin now. I don't want the land. I don't want the memories. Whatever was going on out there, it can stay there. I just hope no one else ever decides to spend the night. The moon hung low, casting a soft glow over the rolling hills of northern Montana. The night was colder than I expected for late autumn, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones even through thick jackets. My name's Jason Miller, and I'm a park ranger. For the last 6 years, I've been stationed in the Bitterroot National Forest. It's a job I've grown accustomed to, a life of isolation, quiet mornings, and nights spent under the endless sky. But tonight, something felt different, something I couldn't shake. I had come to the cabin for a break, just to clear my head. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I was alone, as usual. It was an old cabin, maybe 50 years old, built with thick logs and glass windows that were surprisingly intact. The glass was odd, clear and untouched despite the weather, as if it had been replaced recently. A cozy, isolated spot, tucked away on a bluff overlooking the dark valley below. The place had been abandoned for years before the Forest Service had started maintaining it a few months ago. The moment I stepped inside, I could feel the silence. The air smelled musty, but it had that clean outdoors scent too. I set my backpack on the table near the window, my boots echoing against the hardwood floors as I moved to inspect the rest of the room. The old cabin was in better shape than I expected. The walls were lined with deer antlers, old maps, and hunting trophies. Felt like stepping back in time. I lit a fire in the stone hearth, feeling the warmth begin to chase away the chill. The flames crackled as I unpacked my gear and set up for the night. There was a small kitchen in the back, where I found a couple cans of beans and some rice, enough for a meal. I started boiling water, the small camp stove hissing quietly. As I waited, I checked my phone. No signal as expected. The nearest town was at least a 2-hour drive, and I hadn't passed another soul on the dirt road up here. I was completely cut off. Dinner was uneventful. Beans and rice never taste as good as you hope they will when you're eating alone in a cabin at the edge of the world. After eating, I cleaned up and sat back in one of the old chairs, staring at the fire. The flames danced and flickered, but something about the shadows they cast felt off, like they were moving in ways they shouldn't. It wasn't the fire, it was something else. My mind started to race, as it often did when I was alone for too long. It had been a long day. The morning had been spent hiking up the mountain trails, checking for any illegal hunting signs, and then preparing the cabin for my stay. I'd barely had time to relax before the darkness crept in. The stillness of the woods made everything feel amplified. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of leaves outside the cabin, the crackling of the fire in the hearth. After some time, I decided to get some sleep. It wasn't that late, just after 9, but I was exhausted. I grabbed my sleeping bag and set it up by the fire. As I stretched out, I noticed the cabin felt colder now. The air had a sharp bite to it, even near the warmth of the fire. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, closing my eyes, trying to forget about the strange feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. Just as I started to drift off, I heard it, a soft sound like footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the crackling of the fire. Someone was out there, just beyond the glass. I didn't move. My body felt stiff, like a deer caught in headlights. The footsteps grew louder. I didn't think, my instincts kicked in. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly got to my feet, moving silently across the cabin. The beam of light cut through the darkness outside the glass, revealing nothing. Just the dense forest, a few rustling trees in the distance. But the sound was real. I was sure of it. I waited, watching for any movement. Nothing. The longer I stood there, the more my mind raced. Could it be an animal? Maybe a bear or a wolf? No, it wasn't the kind of sound an animal would make. It was deliberate. I had worked alone in these woods before, many times. The thought of something being out there, something that wasn't supposed to be here, sent a chill through me. I wasn't scared. At least I told myself I wasn't. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Minutes passed, but the sound didn't return. I forced myself to move. I checked the door, making sure it was locked. The place was secure. Nothing out of the ordinary, but something didn't feel right. I sat back down near the fire, telling myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. Maybe just my imagination getting the better of me after a long day. I closed my eyes again, trying to ignore the discomfort gnawing at me. But the silence that followed was even more unsettling. It wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. Suddenly, I heard it again, the footsteps now clearer, closer. I shot to my feet, flashlight in hand. This time, I moved to the window, slowly parting the thick curtains. My breath caught in my throat. There, standing at the edge of the cabin, was a man. He was just standing there, motionless, staring into the cabin through the glass. His features were hard to make out, but I could see enough to know he wasn't wearing a coat, despite the freezing temperatures. He was thin, gaunt, and tall with short, dark hair. His face was pale, almost sickly. He didn't move. My heart hammered in my chest as I backed away from the window, almost tripping over the edge of the table. I ran through my options in my head. Should I call the police? Should I confront him? No, that wasn't smart. I couldn't get a signal out here, and there was no one around for miles. I grabbed the rifle I kept in the corner, the cold steel a comforting weight in my hands. I didn't know if I'd need it, but I couldn't take any chances. I moved to the back door, peering out through the small crack in the doorframe. The man hadn't moved. He was still standing there, looking in. I couldn't make out his expression, but the sight of him standing there, motionless, was enough to send a spike of fear through me. What did he want? I waited. Minutes passed. The man didn't budge. He just stared. Finally, the tension became unbearable. I had to do something. I forced myself to open the door, the cold air hitting me like a slap in the face. I stepped outside, the flashlight beam cutting through the night. The man was gone. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more terrified, but something in the pit of my stomach told me it wasn't over. The night dragged on, and I stayed by the fire, my rifle by my side, eyes darting to every shadow. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep. When the sun finally rose the next morning, I packed my things, eager to leave the cabin behind. As I drove down the dirt road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the edge of the forest, was the man, standing as if waiting. But this time, he was farther off, just a silhouette against the morning light. I didn't stop. I kept driving. And when I reached the town, I never went back to that cabin again. It was late in the fall, the kind of season when the trees lose their leaves in a slow, deliberate process, exposing the bare bones of the forest. I had taken a trip to a small cabin, far away from the noise and distractions of the city. The plan was simple: get away from everything for a while, spend some time with my dog, and enjoy the quiet of the forest. I needed a break, but I didn't expect that it would turn into something far more unsettling. The cabin was tucked away in the mountains of northern New Mexico, a place I had rented off an online listing. It looked perfect for what I wanted: a cozy one-room structure with a wood-burning stove, a couple of chairs, and a small kitchen. There was no electricity, no phone signal, just a woodsy retreat in the middle of nowhere. I figured that it would be just what I needed to reset. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky dimming quickly as the sun sank behind the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains. My dog, a border collie named Max, was as excited as I was. He'd been in the back seat of the truck the entire ride, staring out the window, his tail wagging. Max had been with me for years, and I could tell he was eager to stretch his legs in the wilderness. The first thing I noticed when I got out of the truck was the complete silence. It was unsettling at first. No rustling of leaves in the wind, no distant calls of birds or animals. Just nothing. A deep silence that seemed to press in from every side. I thought it was just the isolation, that maybe it was the kind of quiet that came with being so far out in the mountains. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was a little off. Max didn't seem to notice. He ran off into the woods, chasing after something invisible in the underbrush, and I watched him go, a small comfort in the otherwise empty landscape. I took my bag and started toward the cabin, careful to lock the truck behind me. Felt good to be there, far from everything. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth mixing together. I made my way to the front door, sliding the key into the lock and pushing the door open. Inside, the cabin was exactly as I expected. Rustic, but warm. The small wood stove was already loaded with logs, and I could see the remains of some old ashes from the last time the place was used. The furniture was simple, but it had that worn, lived-in feel that made it seem more like a home than a rental. There was a small bed in the corner, a table with chairs, and a simple kitchen counter with the basics: pots, pans, a sink with a pump, and a stove that ran on propane. I put my bag down and unpacked my things. Max came trotting back a few minutes later, his paws kicking up dust as he ran inside and immediately jumped onto the small couch by the window. I could see the way his tail thumped against the cushions in excitement. It was nice to be out here with him. After getting settled, I decided to take a short walk around the cabin. It had a small clearing in front of it, bordered by thick trees on all sides. I walked down a narrow path that led deeper into the woods, Max at my heels. The forest seemed endless, stretching far beyond what I could see. It was beautiful in a quiet, almost eerie way. As I walked further, the shadows from the trees seemed to grow longer, creeping over the ground as the sun dipped lower behind the mountains. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't quite place it at first, but the air had grown colder, and the silence had become more pronounced. Max, who had been trotting happily at my side, suddenly stopped and stood perfectly still. His ears perked up. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air. His body was tense, his tail low. He was alert, too alert. I stopped and knelt down beside him. "What's up, boy?" I asked, though I knew he couldn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, staring into the forest. His body began to tremble slightly. I stood up slowly, instinctively reaching for the small knife I kept in my pocket. It was more of a precaution than anything. There was nothing out here that would pose any real threat, right? But as I looked around, the feeling of being watched swept over me. I scanned the trees, the brush, the shadows that clung to the trunks of the pines. Nothing. Yet I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Something was out of place. I whistled softly for Max to come back, and he trotted obediently to my side. I didn't feel any better about the situation, but I tried to shake off the unease. I had been in the wilderness many times before, and these feelings were usually just a product of being alone in the woods. I turned and began walking back toward the cabin, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. The night came quickly. It was hard to tell how much time had passed, but the sky was completely dark by the time I lit the stove and set up a small fire. Max curled up by my feet, content to rest. I tried to relax, even though the back of my mind kept replaying the unsettling feeling I'd gotten earlier. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. The cabin was warm, the fire crackled softly, and outside, the forest was still, or so it seemed. Around midnight, I woke up to a soft sound, something scratching at the door. Max was alert instantly, his head lifting from his paws. I froze, straining my ears to hear it more clearly. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate. It was faint, but unmistakable. My heart began to pound. Who could be out there? I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. I glanced at Max. He was staring at the door, his body tense, every muscle coiled. I stood up quietly, moving toward the door. Max followed me, still on edge. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and slowly, carefully, approached the door. I held my breath as I turned the handle. The scratching stopped. Everything was still again, except for the sound of my own heartbeat. I hesitated for a moment, staring out into the dark. The light from the flashlight only revealed a few feet in front of me. The forest beyond was a black void. I didn't know if I was being paranoid, but I wasn't taking any chances. Slowly, I stepped out onto the small porch, Max right behind me. There was no one in sight, no movement, just the whisper of wind through the trees. The moon hung high in the sky, casting faint light on the ground. But as I looked around, I saw something odd. A small patch of dirt near the base of one of the trees had been disturbed. The earth scratched up as though something had been digging. Max growled low in his throat. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling more exposed than I had ever felt. I didn't know what it was, but I could sense that I wasn't alone. That feeling, the one that had gnawed at me earlier, was back, stronger than ever. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. Max stayed close to me, still alert, as if he knew something was wrong. I tried to keep calm, telling myself it was just an animal, a raccoon or something harmless. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I spent the rest of the night with one eye on the door, listening for any further sounds. Nothing came. The scratching stopped, but the silence felt different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore, it was oppressive. The next morning, I woke up early, before the sun had fully risen. Max was already up, his ears twitching as he stood by the door. I got up, grabbed my jacket, and headed outside to check things again. The forest seemed less intimidating in the daylight, but the unease still lingered. I decided to pack up and leave. There was no reason to stay if I felt this uncomfortable. As I loaded up my things and prepared to leave the cabin behind, I noticed something strange. The door had been scratched again. This time, there were deeper gouges in the wood, as though something had tried to force its way in. I didn't look back as I left. Max and I got in the truck, and I drove away, the strange feeling never fully leaving me. It wasn't until I reached the nearest town, hours away, that I finally allowed myself to breathe a little easier. In the weeks that followed, I never did find out what had been outside that cabin or what had caused the scratches. I've told myself it was just a wild animal, a bear or something similar, but part of me still wonders. And every time I take Max for a walk in the woods, I can't help but feel that eerie silence creeping back. That same feeling, that same sense of being watched. It was the spring of 2016 when I took time off from work to head up to my late grandfather's cabin in northern Idaho. I hadn't been back there since I was a teenager. Back then, It was just a quiet old place tucked in between pines and brush, about 3 miles off a cracked county road and another half-mile of rutted dirt track. Now that he was gone, the place had been sitting empty for about 5 years. Nobody in the family wanted to sell it, but no one wanted to use it either. It just sat there. I guess I needed space. Work was pressing down on me. Life in Boise was non-stop traffic and noise, and I hadn't slept right in weeks. So I packed up my Jeep with some gear, filled a cooler with food and water, and decided to stay at the cabin for a week, maybe 2. I didn't tell anyone when I was leaving or how long I'd be gone. My phone barely had signal in that area anyway, and I kind of liked it that way. I just needed to be alone, to breathe. Maybe do some fishing down at Cold Creek and chop some firewood. Keep my hands busy and clear my head. It was early afternoon when I pulled up. The place looked the same and also not the same. The pine needles were piled high on the roof, windows streaked with old rain. The wooden porch steps sagged under my boots. One of the shutters had come loose and was banging slowly in the breeze. The door was still locked, same old brass key still fit. When I stepped inside, the smell hit me first. Dry wood, mouse droppings, and a faint musty scent like old fabric left in the damp. I opened all the windows, swept out cobwebs, and laid out my sleeping bag on the old cot in the back room. There was still a shelf of canned food in the kitchen, most expired. The fridge hadn't run in years, and the old generator in the shed out back was missing its pull cord. Didn't matter. I had my own gear. I brought a small solar panel to charge lights and my phone, even though I had no reception. I lit a few candles, got the wood stove going, and made myself a sandwich. That first night, I sat on the porch, watching the wind move through the trees. The quiet was thick, heavy, almost like a blanket over everything. Not a single car passed in the distance. No human sound at all. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of the property, trying to remember the paths my grandfather used to take through the woods. He had trails back there, faint ones winding between tree stumps and around thick ferns. I found an old rusted animal trap nailed to a tree, long since snapped and forgotten. Plastic jug half buried in moss. It struck me how much nature takes back when we stop maintaining a place. The woods were swallowing everything. That afternoon, I went down to Cold Creek, about a 20-minute walk through brush and slope. The water was high and clear. I tossed a line in for a while but didn't catch anything. Just sat there mostly, staring at the water and the way it glinted in the sun. I headed back up before dark, made a small fire out front, and boiled some beans in a pot. I was asleep by 9. The third day, things started to feel a little off. I noticed prints near the side of the cabin, boot prints. Not mine. I checked. Mine had a different sole pattern. These were longer, flatter, like old work boots. They circled around the back of the cabin and stopped near the woodpile. No path, no return tracks. It had rained lightly that morning, and these prints had come after. They were fresh. I tried not to let it bother me. Maybe a hiker? A hunter passing through? Still, I didn't like that someone had come that close. I kept the hatchet closer that night. I moved my cot into the front room where I could hear more and feel like I had quicker access to the door if something happened. I started locking it even during the day. The next day, the prints were gone. Rain had wiped the ground clean overnight, but I noticed the small shed behind the cabin, where my grandfather used to keep tools, was ajar. I remembered clearly locking it when I got there. The padlock was still hanging from the latch, but it wasn't looped through. Inside, the shelves looked disturbed. A saw blade had been moved, and a coil of rope was gone. A rusty hammer sat on the ground like it had fallen or been dropped. That rope had been sitting on the wall hook since I was a kid. Why take that? I started keeping a knife on me at all times. Not because I thought I'd need it, but because I needed to feel like I had something. I barely slept that night, kept waking at every crack of the walls settling or branches scratching the roof. The next morning, I walked deeper into the woods, thinking maybe I could spot where someone had camped or if there was some sign of another person. But there was nothing, just the hum of bugs and wind in the branches. That night was when it really escalated. I was outside around 8:30, throwing small branches into the fire pit, just listening. The sun was down, but there was still some light. That's when I saw movement in the treeline, back along the east trail where the brush starts to climb. Just a figure, someone standing still, far enough that I couldn't see a face, but close enough that I knew it was a person. They didn't move, they just stood there. I didn't wave, I didn't shout, I just stared. And then they walked backward, not turned around, not left or right. They walked straight backward, slow and smooth, until they blended into the trees. I put the fire out and went inside. I locked the door, shut all the windows. I turned off my lights and sat in the dark, listening. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the cot with the knife gripped in one hand, my flashlight in the other. Every sound felt louder than it was. At first light, I packed a bag, but not to leave. I wanted to know who was out there. I followed the east trail for about a mile, and then I saw it tracks again. That same tread pattern, wide and flat. But now there were more. 2 different sets. One larger, one smaller. They crossed the trail and then veered off into the woods where the trees grew tighter. I followed, ducking under limbs, pushing through thorn bushes. After 30 minutes, I found a clearing. It wasn't much, just a small flattened area with a tarp strung up between trees, camo style. There were beer cans stacked in a plastic crate, a fire pit ringed with rocks, still warm, 2 camp chairs. One of them had a hunting knife stuck deep into the armrest. No bags, no food, no tent. Whoever had been here left in a hurry, and they didn't take everything. I kicked dirt over the fire and backed out slowly. When I got back to the cabin, I took the shotgun from above the mantel. It was old, but I cleaned it up and loaded the shells I found in the cabinet below. I didn't want to use it, I just needed something heavier than a knife. I slept inside again, shotgun across my lap. That night, I woke up around 2:40 a.m. to a sound, 3 slow knocks on the front door. Not banging, just a dull, deliberate knock. I didn't move. I held my breath. Came again. 3 knocks, then nothing. I sat there for maybe an hour listening. Not a single footstep. No sound of walking away. Just silence again. When the sun rose, I opened the door. On the porch, at the foot of the door, lay the rope from the shed, coiled neatly, like someone had brought it back and left it there. That was the final straw. I packed my gear by 8 a.m., loaded everything into the Jeep. I took one last look at the cabin. I didn't lock it, I just drove. My tires spun a little in the soft dirt but caught hold, and I rolled out past the tree line, past the old county road, and didn't look in the rear view until I hit pavement. I never told anyone about what happened. I didn't want to explain it, and I still don't understand it. There were no police to call. No crime had happened technically. Just people, real people who had been walking around that place while I slept, creeping up close enough to leave things behind. Maybe squatters, maybe something worse. I don't know. I sold the cabin a year later. Some guy from Oregon bought it for cash. Never asked about the history, and I never offered it. I haven't been back since. What stuck with me most wasn't fear. It was that calm. The way they moved, the way they watched. The rope wasn't a message. It was a reminder, a little detail to let me know I wasn't alone. Not for a single minute of that trip. Not in the cabin, not in the woods, not even on the Creekside Trail. People talk about haunted houses or monsters in the woods, but the real danger is the ones who don't say anything, the ones who watch, the ones who wait, and then decide you're interesting enough to visit. It was the fall of 2023 when I found myself driving through the winding back roads of the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. I'd been in need of some space to think, some solitude to work through a few things in my life. I was 28, recently moved to a new town, and really just trying to get my feet back under me after a messy breakup. A weekend retreat was supposed to be the perfect solution. I had rented a cabin through one of those online booking sites. The pictures had looked nice, simple, rustic, isolated. I didn't mind the idea of being out there, away from it all, in the middle of the woods. Honestly, I liked the idea of being far from people. There was a certain freedom in the quiet, even though it wasn't the type of quiet I'd grown up with. I grew up in the suburbs, and the silence out here in the mountains was different. Felt ominous in a way that I couldn't quite explain. The cabin was about an hour past the nearest town, on a road that looked barely used. The last 5 miles were a narrow dirt path that made the tires of my old Jeep rattle and the car's suspension groan under the uneven terrain. The sun was beginning to set by the time I arrived, casting long shadows across the road and making the trees look like dark sentinels standing watch over the woods. When I first pulled up to the cabin, I didn't notice anything unusual. It was a simple, single-story structure, wooden with a porch on the front. There was a small shed in the back, and a stack of firewood piled neatly against the side of the house. No neighbors for miles, just trees and more trees. I grabbed my bag and walked inside. The interior smelled of pine and dust, a bit musty but in a charming, lived-in way. The floors creaked as I moved, and the only sound was the occasional snap of branches in the wind outside. I set my things down and opened the windows, letting in the cool mountain air. Felt good to finally be alone. I spent the evening unpacking, setting up a few things, and enjoying the simple pleasure of a warm fire in the wood stove. I hadn't planned on doing much for the first night. A few beers, a good book, and some silence were all I needed. I was just starting to unwind when I heard it. A soft knock on the door. It was quick, almost a tap, barely audible over the sound of the crackling fire. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I hadn't passed another car on the way in, and I certainly hadn't seen anyone on the property. I cautiously made my way to the door, wondering if it was a neighbor or someone who had somehow wandered too close. As I reached for the handle, I froze. The knocking came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I stood still, listening. The cabin was quiet. The only noise now was my own breathing. I slowly opened the door, just a crack, peering out into the darkened yard. No one. The night air was cool and still, the trees swaying gently under the moonlight. I stepped outside and looked around, my breath coming out in small clouds. I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then something caught my eye. Footprints in the dirt near the porch, leading away into the trees. They were fresh, the edges still soft from whatever had made them. I squinted, my heart racing slightly. The tracks were too small to belong to any large animal, but I couldn't make out what they were. They seemed human, but that didn't make sense. The nearest neighbor was miles away. I checked the cabin again, locked up tight, then stepped back inside, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I spent the next few hours trying to push the uneasy feeling aside. I had the fire roaring, and I even made myself a late dinner. But as I settled onto the couch to read, the sense of being watched crept back into my mind. Then I heard it again, a scraping sound, like something dragging along the side of the cabin. I stood up and walked to the window, but by the time I looked out, there was nothing there. The yard was empty, just the light from the cabin casting long shadows against the trees. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things at this point. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me, making my mind play tricks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept hearing small noises throughout the night, crunching leaves, the wind whistling through the trees. But there was something else, something deliberate. something close. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise made me jump. I kept the lights on and locked the doors, but the creeping paranoia was getting to me. Around 3 a.m., I heard the faint sound of footsteps on the porch again. But this time, it wasn't the soft tap I had heard before. These were heavier, slower, more deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped to the door, peering through the peephole. No one. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding in my chest, but eventually, I couldn't take the tension anymore. I needed to figure out what was going on. I grabbed my coat and boots and stepped outside, the night air colder than it had been before. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but the yard was empty. Still, those damn tracks, they were still there, running around the side of the cabin and deep into the woods. Whoever had been here was close. The woods felt darker now, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I hesitated but decided to follow the trail. Maybe there was an explanation for all of this. Maybe someone had just wandered too far from the road and gotten lost. I walked deeper into the trees, the ground soft underfoot, until the tracks stopped near an old shed that I hadn't noticed before. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. My stomach churned. I took a deep breath and approached the door, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. Inside, it was pitch dark, but there was something else. The smell, something foul. I stepped inside cautiously, the door creaking shut behind me. As I shone my flashlight around, I nearly dropped it. There, in the far corner of the shed, was a figure. A person hunched over, their face obscured by a hood. The person didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that knocked the breath out of me. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and closer now, echoed outside. Panic set in. I was trapped. There was no way out. But before I could react, the figure moved. Not towards me, but toward the far wall, where a pile of old tools and wood lay in disarray. They picked up something, a crowbar, and then stood motionless, waiting. I had to get out. Now, I scrambled for the door, adrenaline flooding my veins. I grabbed the handle, pulling with all my strength. The door cracked open just enough for me to squeeze through, and I bolted into the woods. I didn't stop running until I reached the Jeep. I drove all the way back to town, never looking back. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down until I was safely in a well-lit hotel room. That was it. I wasn't going back to that cabin, and I sure as hell wasn't going to find out what had been lurking in the woods. I never did get to the bottom of it. The next morning, when I called the local sheriff's office, they said no one had been reported missing or in trouble near that cabin. There were no signs of forced entry, and when they investigated, the shed was empty. The tracks in the dirt were gone, too. I left the area and never returned. The memories still haunt me. Those footprints, the scraping sound on the cabin, and that figure in the shed. But the scariest part wasn't the figure. It wasn't the isolation or the unease in the air. It was the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had been followed. And whoever or whatever was out there in the woods knew exactly where I was. I never stayed in a cabin in the woods again, not even close. It was late September of 2019 when I drove out to a quiet patch of forestland I had bought the year before, a few hours outside of Eugene, Oregon. I was 32 back then. I had saved up a bit of money from years of freelance carpentry and remodeling work, enough to afford the land and a beat-up 2003 Dodge Ram that still ran better than it looked. I had no wife, no kids, and after my father passed earlier that year, no real reason to stay in the city. So I made a choice. I packed up my tools, loaded up supplies, and went out to build a small off-grid cabin for myself. No electricity, no neighbors, just me, the trees, and the work. The land was deep in the woods, about 35 minutes down a narrow dirt road that ran rough with rocks and tree roots. I had cleared out a flat spot the year before for camping, but this time I came back for something more permanent. I wanted to get the cabin framed before the weather turned too cold. That was the plan. The day I arrived, it was already cloudy. I remember unloading everything in silence. No birds chirping. The wind was still. Even the sound of my boots crunching the dirt seemed loud. That silence didn't bother me. I liked the isolation. I'd always been more comfortable with trees and tools than people. I got to work right away. The first few days were focused on digging the holes for the foundation piers and laying down concrete footers. The soil was soft but moist, and it soaked into my jeans. I remember wiping mud from my face constantly. I had brought a tent and a tarp and set it up under a patch of tall pines just off to the side of where I wanted the cabin. I didn't sleep much the first few nights, just a mix of wind picking up through the trees and the constant patter of pine needles hitting the tarp. By day 4, the clouds were hanging heavier and the temperature dropped, the kind of air that clings to your skin and seeps into your bones. I kept working. I framed up the floor and started hauling in the 2x6 boards for the walls. I had to make several trips down to the trailhead where I parked the truck. No real driveway yet, just a cleared path. I pulled a lot of weight on a sled I built out of old plywood and rope. That night it rained. Hard. It started just before sunset, and I remember sitting under the tarp eating from a can of chili, watching the rain roll off the nylon in heavy sheets. The firewood I had stacked was already soaked. I laid in my sleeping bag, listening to the sound of it all. The creaks of trees, the slapping of rain against the leaves, and something else. Something like footsteps. Now, I'm not the paranoid type. I've spent a lot of time in the woods. I know the sounds animals make, but these didn't sound like deer. Too steady, too slow. I sat up and unzipped the flap of my tent just a little, poking my head out. Everything was black except for the dull outline of trees under the cloudy night. I waited a minute. Nothing, just the rain. The next morning, I found something strange. Near the edge of the clearing where the trees thinned out, I saw boot prints. Not mine. Bigger, deeper. They circled around the build site once, then stopped about 20 feet from my tent. The mud was fresh. Whoever it was came during the night and left. I didn't panic. I just stood there, staring at them for a long time, my breath fogging in the cold air. I checked my truck. Everything inside was untouched. No sign of broken locks. Tools were all there, just the prints. I told myself maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone just got turned around and passed through. I had no cell signal, no way to call anyone unless I hiked an hour out to where the ridge picked up reception. I decided not to leave. I wasn't going to stop. I built the front wall that day, hammering in nails with more force than usual. I kept checking the woods every few minutes, listening. Nothing came back. That night, the rain returned, heavier than before. I slept with my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. Didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found the boot prints again. This time closer. They came right up to my fire pit. One set, deep. Again, not mine. My boots were smaller and worn different treads. I took a long time staring at the pattern in the mud. They faced the tent, just stood there for a while, then left the same way. I started second-guessing myself. Was someone watching me? Why didn't they say anything? Was it a local? A squatter? I wasn't sure, but I kept working. I wanted to finish that cabin. It was more than just a place to stay. It felt like something I owed myself. By day 7, I had all 4 walls up and braced. The roof rafters were still a few days away. I covered the top with a tarp to keep out the rain. I was soaked most of the time, gloves wrinkled, fingers stiff. My hands were cracked from the cold. Food was running low, mostly cans and instant rice. I ate less, slept less. That night, I stayed up late by the fire, watching the trees. The rain had stopped for a while. Everything smelled wet, moss, dirt, pine. I didn't see anything, but I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, just breathing, heavy, somewhere close. I stood up and pointed my flashlight toward the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth. Nothing, but the breathing stopped when I moved. It wasn't mine. I was holding my breath the whole time. I barely slept. I kept the fire going until dawn. The prints were back again in the morning. This time they circled the tent twice. Then they walked out toward the woods and vanished. I lost track of time after that. Every hour felt stretched. I finished putting up the roof supports while my eyes scanned the trees every few seconds. I stopped playing music from the old radio I brought. I didn't want anything to cover up the sounds outside. That night, it started raining again, harder than ever. The kind of rain that pounds the ground like fists. My fire wouldn't light. Everything was soaked. I stayed inside the tent, zipped up in my bag, every muscle tight. And that's when I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, digging. It was slow, scraping, deliberate, just outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away. I froze, kept going. Scratch, pause, scratch again, like metal on dirt. I sat up, unzipped the flap just a crack, and looked out. The rain made it hard to see anything. I clicked on my flashlight, aimed it out. Nothing, but the digging stopped the second the light was on. I waited, then I stepped out, wearing just my jacket and boots over pajamas. Rain was pounding my shoulders, running down my face. I walked toward the sound, scanning the ground. That's when I saw it. A small hole, maybe a foot wide, a few inches deep, still fresh. The mud was piled to one side, and next to it a shovel. Not mine. It was old. Wooden handle, metal blade chipped and rusted, like something left in a barn for years. I picked it up, turned around in circles, scanning everything. Nothing. No one. I took the shovel back to the fire pit, tossed it to the side, and sat there, soaked, watching the tree line until the sky started to lighten. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. When morning finally came, I packed everything. Tools, tarp, supplies. I threw it all into the back of the truck as fast as I could. The floor and frame of the cabin stood there, half-built, wet from rain. I stared at it one last time. Part of me hated leaving it behind, but something deeper told me it was the right call. Before I left, I went back to where the hole had been. I dug it out a little more just to see. The dirt was soft, nothing buried there. But nearby, under a pile of wet leaves, I found something else. A can. An old tin can, rusted at the top, opened halfway. Inside was a rolled-up piece of paper, soaked and torn. I opened it, hands shaking. There was just one thing written on it with a pencil, faded and barely legible. Don't stay. No name, no explanation, just that. I threw the can back into the woods and got in the truck. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway. Weeks passed before I could sleep normally again. I told a few people what happened. No one really knew what to say. I never went back to that property. Sold it the next spring at a loss. Didn't care. I live in town now. Still build things. Still love the woods. But I don't sleep in them anymore. And sometimes, when it rains hard at night, I wake up without knowing why. Listening, remembering, not for ghosts, not for stories, just for the sound of breathing, and digging, and boots in the mud. I was 36 when it happened. I'd been working as a tow truck operator in the suburbs just outside Chicago for most of my adult life. Long hours, unpredictable shifts, and a lot of time alone. Over the years, I'd learned to enjoy the solitude. Most of the time, I liked it better than talking to people. But after the wreck of the past few months, losing my younger brother in a car crash and my girlfriend of 5 years walking out the door without a goodbye, I needed a break from the city, from the noise, from everything. That's when I found the listing online for a cheap, remote cabin up north in Wisconsin. The kind of place with no cell signal, no internet, and barely any road leading to it. Sounded like exactly what I needed. The cabin was about 45 minutes outside of a town called Pine Hollow. I'd never heard of it, and neither had anyone else I talked to. Small, rural, out of the way. I rented the place for a week through some no-name website. It was owned by a retired guy named Stan who only used it in the summers. Said it'd be perfect for a reset, which is exactly what I was hoping for. I packed up my truck with some groceries, a cooler of ice, my old sleeping bag, and my brother's Remington rifle. Not that I expected to use it, just felt better bringing it along. I left early on a Monday morning in May 2023. Took me almost 6 hours to get there. The last stretch of road turned into gravel, then just dirt. Trees everywhere.
No streetlights.
No houses, just me and the forest. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops. I remember stepping out of the truck and thinking, this is what silence really sounds like. No engines, no sirens, no people. Just wind and birds and the distant sound of frogs in the lake behind the trees. The cabin itself was small but solid. One room with a wood stove, a bed, a kitchen counter, and a table. No electricity except a single solar panel rigged up to charge a battery for lights. There was a shed behind it with chopped wood and a locked box of tools. Stan had left a handwritten note on the table with directions for the water pump and the outhouse. I set my things down, ate some cold chicken, and poured myself a glass of whiskey. I felt tired, but not in a bad way. The kind of tired that feels clean, like you've finally stepped out of your own skin for a while. That first night, I slept straight through.
No dreams, no nightmares.
I woke up early with the sun burning through the window and made coffee on the propane stove. Then I went for a walk down the trail behind the cabin that led to the lake. The air smelled like pine and wet dirt. I saw deer tracks and heard something big moving through the trees, but never caught a glimpse of it. Probably a moose, maybe a bear. Didn't matter. I felt more alive in that moment than I had in months. The next 2 days passed in a haze of nothingness. I fished off the dock and didn't catch a thing. I read an old book I found on the shelf about logging in northern Wisconsin. I chopped some wood just to have something to do. At night, I'd sit on the steps and sip whiskey, watching the stars blink to life above the treetops. It was exactly what I came for. Total stillness.
No responsibilities, no sedulis, no distractions.
But on the fourth night, something changed. I was outside around 10:30 p.m. It had just rained, and everything smelled fresh and wet. The moon was out, not full but bright enough to light the clearing around the cabin. I was leaning back in a folding chair, finishing a cigarette, when I saw the headlights. They were far off at first, bouncing slowly through the trees. I stood up, squinting through the dark. I hadn't seen a single person since I got there, and Stan had told me nobody came out this way unless they were lost or looking for trouble. My first thought was some drunk hunters got turned around or someone's ATV broke down. I put out the cigarette, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped off the porch. The lights got closer. It was a black SUV, one of those old Ford Explorers. No markings, but the kind of vehicle you still see cops using out in rural places. It pulled up slow and stopped a good 20 feet from the cabin. I stood there, not moving, trying to figure out if I should say something or wait. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He looked like a cop, about 6 feet tall, mid-40s maybe, with a thick neck and a stiff walk like he wore a belt with too much gear too often. His uniform was plain, just dark gray pants and a matching shirt, but there was a badge on his chest and a pistol on his hip. He didn't look at me, just walked around the front of the SUV, opened the passenger door, and stood there for a long time. I didn't say anything. I just watched. My hands were getting cold even though it wasn't that chilly. Something about him felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He wasn't yelling or charging me. But the way he stood there, like he didn't care whether I saw him or not, it gave me the kind of unease that builds from your stomach up. After a minute, he shut the passenger door and looked straight at me. I nodded, just a quick, hey sort of nod, even though I didn't speak. He stared for another few seconds, then turned back, got in the SUV, and drove away. Slowly, like he was memorizing everything as he left. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about why a cop or someone dressed like one would show up that late with no warning. He didn't ask if I was okay, didn't check my ID, didn't even say anything. It was like he was confirming something, and now that he'd seen it, he didn't need to stick around. The next day, I walked back down the trail to the lake, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking over my shoulder. Every branch crack felt louder than it should have. Every crow call made me flinch. When I got back to the cabin, I checked the windows, made sure the doors locked, even pushed a chair under the knob like that would do anything. By the 6th day, I started hearing noises at night. Not animals, not the wind. These were slow, steady footsteps on the dirt path around the cabin. Once around 2 a.m., I swore I heard someone breathing outside the back window. I laid there in the dark with the rifle across my chest, heart thudding like a hammer in my throat. The final night is when it happened. It was after midnight. The moon was bright again. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard the SUV engine. Not close, still a ways off, but I knew the sound now. Gravel popping under tires, branches brushing metal. I rolled out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and crept to the window. Nothing yet, just the woods. Then a glint between the trees, headlights cutting through fog. He was back. This time he parked closer, right at the edge of the clearing. I shut off the flashlight and ducked behind the couch, watching from the shadow. The driver door opened. Same guy, same uniform, but this time he had something in his hand. It looked like a crowbar or maybe a metal baton. He walked straight toward the cabin. I didn't think. I ran to the shed, threw open the door, and yanked the rifle from its case. I didn't want to shoot anyone. I just wanted him to go away. But by the time I turned back, he was already inside. He didn't knock, didn't say anything, just kicked the door in like he had a right to be there. I watched from behind the trees, shaking so bad I could barely hold the rifle steady. He walked in and stood still, like he was listening. Then he turned and opened the fridge, looked inside, shut it. Then he stepped back outside, scanned the yard, and said something I couldn't hear. I stayed crouched out of sight for what felt like forever. He started walking the perimeter of the cabin, slow, methodical, like he was waiting for me to reveal myself. I moved deeper into the trees, heart pounding, mouth dry. That's when I stepped on a branch. The crack echoed through the clearing like a gunshot. He turned, raised the baton, started walking toward the trees, aimed. I didn't want to, I didn't plan to, but I aimed. He kept coming. I fired. The shot lit up the night like a camera flash. He stumbled, took another step, then dropped face first into the dirt. I didn't move. I stood there, still aiming, for at least a full minute. When I finally approached, I could see the blood soaking through his shirt, a perfect hole in the center of his chest. The badge had fallen off. I picked it up. Cheap plastic. No name, no number. Just the word deputy in block letters. That's when I realized he wasn't a cop. He was wearing a uniform, yeah, but nothing about it was real. The gun on his hip was a prop. The SUV had no plates. I checked his pockets and found a keyring, some cash, and a folded-up map with the cabin circled in red ink. My name was written next to it. I called the sheriff's office in Pine Hollow the next morning as soon as the sun came up. Drove into town to use the payphone. Told them everything. They came out, took statements, secured the scene. Turns out, the guy was a former deputy who got fired 2 years ago for stalking a woman who had a restraining order against him. He disappeared after that. No one knew where he went. They think he'd been squatting in old seasonal cabins and targeting renters. I wasn't his first visit, just the first one who fought back. They cleared me of everything, said it was self-defense, gave me back the rifle a month later. I never went back to the cabin. I still dream about it sometimes. The headlights cutting through the trees. The way he looked at me like I was already his, like he'd picked me long before I ever showed up. But I'm here. I survived. And now, I know that silence isn't always peace. Sometimes silence is a warning, and you better damn well listen. I'll never forget that week I spent up in the mountains of southern Colorado, in a cabin that felt like it was sitting right on the edge of the world. It was October 2019. I was 32 then. My name's Nathan, and at the time, I lived in Fort Collins, about 5 hours north of where everything happened. I'd just gone through a messy breakup, the kind that leaves your apartment full of reminders you don't want to see, and your mind stuck in the same loops for days on end. I needed out. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I just wanted silence, trees, and the kind of cold that makes you forget about anything but surviving it. A buddy of mine from college, Alex, had this old family cabin his parents weren't using. It was outside a tiny town called Trinchera, closer to the New Mexico border than anywhere else. When I told him I needed to get away for a bit, he offered the place up without hesitation. Said there was no Wi-Fi, barely any cell reception, and the nearest store was a 45-minute drive. Sounded perfect. I packed up my old 2004 Tacoma with some canned food, bottled water, extra firewood, and all the gear I figured I'd need for a week. Sleeping bag, rifle, axe, heavy-duty flashlight, and a few notebooks in case I felt like writing anything down. I brought my camera, too. I liked photographing wildlife when I had the chance. The drive down was uneventful, long but peaceful. I got there just before sunset on a Wednesday. The dirt road leading to the cabin was steep and winding, cutting through tall pines that cast long shadows over the gravel. The place was built in the 60s, just a single-story log structure with a tin roof and a covered porch. There was no lock on the door, just a heavy latch from the inside, and the windows had old, yellowing curtains drawn tight. Alex had told me not to expect anything fancy. No electricity, just a wood stove, a battery-powered radio, and a propane lantern hanging from a ceiling hook. The cabin stood in a small clearing, maybe 30 yards across. Beyond that, it was nothing but thick forest in every direction. You couldn't see another house, couldn't hear any roads, just the wind and trees. It was exactly what I needed. That first night, I built a fire in the stove, cracked open a can of chili, and sat on the porch until the stars came out. It got cold fast. I'd brought enough layers, but the quiet out there felt colder than the air. When the wind picked up, it made the trees sound like they were whispering to each other. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a banging sound. My heart jumped. It sounded like someone thudding against the back wall of the cabin. Not hard, more like a fist tapping slowly but deliberately. I lay there under my sleeping bag, holding my breath. It was so quiet otherwise that I could hear the creaking of the stove as it cooled. The banging came again, 3 times, then silence. I waited. Nothing. I grabbed the flashlight and slipped my boots on, quietly unlatched the door and stepped outside. The cold hit me like a wall. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. I walked around the cabin slowly. Nothing. No tracks, no animals. The ground was covered in dry pine needles, so I would have seen prints. I didn't sleep much after that. Next day, I chalked it up to a tree branch. Maybe the wind had knocked something against the wall. I spent the afternoon hiking a bit down one of the trails behind the cabin. Found a small stream, shot a few photos of a hawk perched on a dead tree. I didn't see another soul out there. When I got back, I noticed something weird. My backpack, the one I'd left by the front door, had been moved, just slightly. The straps were positioned differently. I hadn't touched it since unloading the truck. I opened it up. Everything seemed fine, nothing missing. I figured maybe I bumped it without realizing. Still, it put me on edge. The next night, I was more alert. I brought the rifle inside with me. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not banging this time. It was footsteps, slow, crunching ones, moving around the cabin. Then silence, then more. I turned off the lantern and crouched near the window. The moon was out, casting light across the clearing. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, just a flicker of a shadow near the edge of the woods. I didn't go outside that time. Instead, I waited until morning and then did a full sweep of the area. Still no prints. Still no signs of animals or people. But I did notice something strange. The wooden steps leading to the porch had a crack in one of the boards. A fresh one, like it had just been stepped on hard. That evening, I drove into town. Took about 45 minutes to get to a little gas station store that sold everything from propane to frozen burritos. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, just grabbed more water and a couple things to eat. On the way back, I stopped at a pull-off and sat on the tailgate, watching the forest for a while. When I got back to the cabin, the front door was open. I know I locked it before I left. The latch was simple, just a hook and loop, but I always checked it. I went inside slowly, rifle raised. Nothing was missing. Nothing seemed disturbed. Except for one thing. There were pine needles on the floor, a trail of them leading from the doorway to the far wall, then stopping. No wind could have blown them in. The porch was clean. The needles were placed, not scattered, like someone had walked in with them on their boots and then stopped. I followed them with my eyes. They ended near the foot of my sleeping bag. I felt sick. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up with the rifle lantern turned off. I listened. Around 1 a.m., I heard breathing, right outside the wall. Slow, steady breathing. Then it stopped. Then it was right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing was calm. It didn't sound scared. It sounded patient. Then I heard the soft creak of the porch boards. Then it was gone. The next morning, I walked to the edge of the clearing. I paced the tree line. That's when I found something that stopped me cold. A small pile of rocks, carefully stacked. 5 of them, balanced neatly. On top was a dead bird, a raven or maybe a crow. Its wings spread, body stiff. No blood, just dead, like it had been placed there. I kicked the pile over, left the body there. By now, I should have packed up and left, but something in me didn't want to run. I was angry. I felt like someone was messing with me, and I wanted to catch them. I set up a trail cam near the porch, one I had in my gear for hunting. Then I waited again. That night, I heard the sounds again. Breathing, steps. I didn't move. I waited until sunrise and checked the camera. Dead batteries, fresh ones drained. Completely. I switched in new batteries from my flashlight. Waited all day. That night, I set up the camera again. No lantern, no sound, just darkness and cold. I heard the steps again, closer this time. At one point, I swear something brushed against the outside wall right next to where I was sitting, like a palm dragging across the logs. The next morning, I checked the trail cam. This time, it had images. Only 3. The first was just the porch at night. Normal. The second showed a figure. Just barely, the motion blur was heavy. but it looked like a person. Tall, thin, not wearing anything I could recognize. No clear clothes, no face I could make out. Just the outline of someone standing completely still, facing the door. The third was black. Something had covered the lens. That was it. I packed everything and loaded the truck. Before I left, I checked the inside of the cabin one more time. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe a sign that I imagined it all. Maybe some proof it wasn't real. Instead, I found something carved into the underside of the porch. I only noticed it as I walked out. I crouched down and saw the letters scratched into the wood. Stay still, nothing else. I didn't report it. What would I even say? I went back to Fort Collins and didn't talk about it for months. Not until now. I don't know who was out there. I don't think it was some local playing a prank. Felt planned. Intentional. I still think about that breathing sometimes. How calm it was. How close. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. But I didn't, and I never went back. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin that sat just beyond a small forgotten graveyard. It wasn't some weird challenge or anything like that. I had just gotten out of a long, exhausting relationship and I wanted to be alone. Away from people, away from my phone, and most of all, away from the noise of the city. My name's Eric, and back then I was living in northern Michigan. The cabin belonged to a coworker's cousin. It was an old family place they didn't really use anymore. It didn't even have power or running water, but I didn't care. It was free, it was remote, and it came with solitude. They gave me directions scribbled out on the back of an old gas receipt and warned me that the road was more of a trail and that I'd need to leave my car behind at a certain point. The walk from the car to the cabin was about half a mile through pine woods, narrow and uneven. It was mid-October, cold but not freezing, with that sharp, dry smell of fallen leaves and moss thick in the air. I had brought a heavy backpack filled with canned food, a camp stove, a sleeping bag, and some other basics. I also had a rifle slung over my shoulder. Not because I expected trouble, but because I didn't want to be caught unarmed if a black bear decided to get curious. The cabin itself was small, made of gray, weathered logs that had gone soft at the corners. The roof was sagging a little on one side, and the chimney looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a single room with a cot, a wood stove, and a few dusty shelves. Outside was an old outhouse that leaned like it might fall over in a stiff wind, and just beyond that, maybe 30 or 40 yards away, was the edge of the graveyard. The graveyard was what had made me hesitate at first. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything like that, but there's something about gravestones poking out of the ground like broken teeth that makes the skin on your arms tighten. The headstones were small and worn, most of the names unreadable, but I could make out a few from the 1800s. The whole place was surrounded by a rusted iron fence, half buried in leaves and brush. I didn't plan to hang around there, obviously, but I wasn't spooked enough to back out. It was just a spot, just a place where people had been buried a long time ago. That's all. The first night was peaceful, cold but not unbearable. I boiled water on the stove and made some instant noodles, then tucked into my sleeping bag early with a flashlight and a paperback novel. Outside, I could hear nothing but wind and the occasional creak of the trees shifting in the breeze. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. Around midnight, I woke up to a dull thud. Not loud, but clear enough that it pulled me straight from sleep. I sat up and listened. Nothing, just silence. I figured it was probably a branch falling or maybe an animal knocking something over. I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went outside to check around the cabin. Nothing was out of place, but I did see fresh tracks. Boot prints in the soft dirt just off the path near the outhouse. They weren't mine. I had been walking mostly in and out from the same direction, and these prints were deeper, wider. Someone had been walking behind the cabin, looping around toward the back. I told myself it was probably an old trail left behind by whoever had come up last. The prints didn't look fresh. Maybe they were just newly exposed after the wind blew some leaves off them. Still, I kept the rifle closer that day. I carried it even when I walked down to the creek a few hundred yards away to refill my water jug. The air smelled different that afternoon. Not rotten, just still, like everything had gone quiet at once. I didn't see a single bird, didn't hear a squirrel. No bugs either, just the sound of my own boots on the leaves. The wind had died. Even the trees seemed stiff. Back at the cabin, I kept checking the area. I wasn't paranoid, not yet, but I wanted to be sure I was alone. I went around the back and noticed something else strange. On the far corner of the graveyard, the iron fence had been bent inward, like something large had forced its way through. But there was no sign of what. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the stove lit and stayed wrapped in my sleeping bag, rifle beside me, flashlight in hand. A couple times I thought I heard movement outside, soft crunches of leaves, but it could have been my imagination. The walls of the cabin were thin, and every sound seemed louder in the dark. By the fourth day, I was starting to feel tense. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been around. I started noticing subtle things. Scratches in the bark of a tree near the path, a piece of cord tied to a branch like a marker, and a weird pile of rocks beside one of the graves that hadn't been there before. I spent the next hour standing by the fence, staring at the stones. Something had been messing around in here. The pile of rocks had been stacked deliberately, not just scattered, but arranged, almost like a tiny pyramid, right on top of a headstone that looked like it belonged to a child. I didn't touch it. That night, just before dark, I spotted movement in the woods. A figure, tall, in dark clothing, about 50 yards away, standing behind a tree. I froze. He didn't move. I watched him for maybe a minute, and then he was just gone. I didn't hear him run, didn't hear him leave. He had just disappeared into the trees. I stayed up that entire night with the rifle on my lap, staring at the front door, listening. When the sun came up, I packed my bag. I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I started hiking back toward where I'd left my car. But when I got there, the tires had been slashed. All four. The windows were intact, nothing was stolen, but the tires were done. Knife marks clear as day. Clean, deep cuts. There was no cell service that deep in the woods. I knew the closest house was about 5 or 6 miles out along a dirt road that forked off the trail. So I had a choice. Stay at the cabin another night or walk those miles before dark. I started walking. I didn't stop. I didn't even sit down. I was too full of adrenaline. Every sound made me jump. Every gust of wind sent my heart racing. I felt like I was being followed the whole way. By the time I made it to the edge of a property with a lit-up porch, I was shaking. A man came out, older guy, maybe in his 60s, and looked at me like I was a ghost. He asked if I was all right, and I just nodded. He drove me into town without asking too many questions. I didn't even tell him about the cabin or the graveyard. I just said my car had been vandalized and I needed to get home. I filed a police report the next morning. They didn't find anything. When I called my coworker's cousin to ask about the cabin, he just said, "We stopped using that place for a reason." I never asked what he meant. I sold the rifle not long after, stopped going into the woods for a few years. I still think about that place sometimes, about the headstones, the figure behind the tree, the way the wind stopped. I still don't believe in ghosts, but I believe in people. And that's worse, because whatever was out there with me wasn't some spirit. It was real. It walked. It watched. It waited. Someone had been living out there, maybe for years, watching the graveyard, watching the cabin. I just got lucky. I left before they made their move. That's the part one keep coming back to. how close it felt, how quiet they were, how careful. I still wonder if that figure behind the tree saw me too early, if they were waiting for me to stay one more night. Maybe that's all it would have taken. One more night, one more moment of silence. But I didn't give them that, and that's why I'm still here. I was 37 the first time I went on a solo hunting trip that far north. It was early November 2016, and I had taken 2 weeks off work just to be alone in the woods. I needed it. After the last year I'd had, divorce, job changes, my dad passing, it felt like everything around me was crumbling. I needed to feel something solid again. Hunting had always been my way to reset. Get away, get quiet, and get back to basics. No distractions, no people, just the sound of your boots in the brush and the bite of cold wind in your face. The cabin belonged to a guy I used to work with years ago. Mike something, I can't even remember his last name now. He'd moved to Wyoming and never came back for it. Said I could use it whenever, so I took him up on it. The place was tucked way out in the forest, about 60 miles past Kalispell, Montana. Past the logging roads, up a dirt path barely wide enough for a pickup. The kind of place where nobody just stumbles across you. I left at 4 in the morning on a Tuesday and reached the trailhead a little before noon. The final stretch was 10 miles off-road, gravel, dirt, then rutted paths lined with lodgepole pine. My old Ford barely made it. I stopped a mile out when the road got too sketchy and hiked the rest with my gear. Took me close to an hour to reach the cabin. The cabin itself looked just like it had in the photos. One room, old logs, patched roof, small stove in the corner, and a wood pile stacked out back. No power, no cell service, no running water. A spring trickled about 100 feet downhill, icy and clean. It was perfect. I spent the first day getting set up, hauled my food inside, stocked the stove, loaded the rifle, double-checked my gear. I was hunting elk, and that part of Montana had always been rich with them. I'd hunted before, but never this isolated. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the stove ticking as it cooled. Day 2, I was out before sunrise. It was bitter cold, frost crunching under my boots, rifle slung over my shoulder. I worked my way uphill along a ridge, glassing the valleys below with my scope. No signs of elk, just a few old tracks, but it felt good to move, to breathe air that crisp. On the way back that afternoon, I saw something strange. It wasn't elk sign. It was a torn up patch of ground near a creek bend. Looked like something had been dragged. There were boot prints too, not mine. Old, but not too old, maybe a few days at most. I stared at them longer than I should have. They didn't belong there. Nobody came out this far. That night, I locked the cabin door and made sure my rifle was loaded before I slept. By day 4, I still hadn't seen any elk, just tracks and distant bugles. I pushed deeper into the timber, climbing higher ridges and glassing every basin. The cold settled in harder every day. I come back each night with my legs sore and my boots soaked. It was that 4th afternoon when I saw him. I was about 2 miles from the cabin, crouched near a fallen tree, scanning the slope below. That's when I saw movement, a flash of dark clothing between the trees. At first I thought it might be another hunter, which would have been strange out here. I waited, watching, and there he was again. A man, maybe 50 yards off, walking with something in his hand. Not a rifle. It looked like a long-handled axe. I stayed still. He didn't see me. He moved slow, methodical, like he knew where he was going. But it wasn't a trail. It was steep, brushy ground. No reason for anyone to be walking through there. He didn't have orange on either, which any hunter would. Just a dark coat, dirty jeans, and the axe. I watched him until he disappeared downhill. Then I waited another 20 minutes just to be safe. Back at the cabin, I couldn't get it out of my head. Who the hell hikes out here, no gear, no blaze orange, carrying an axe? Maybe he was a trapper or someone who lived off-grid. That was possible. But something about the way he moved bothered me. Too deliberate. Like he wasn't just wandering, like he had a plan. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound made me sit up and listen. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I kept the rifle loaded and the door barred anyway. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach sink. Footprints. Human, unmistakable. They came up the slope from the east, maybe 20 yards from the cabin. Just a few steps off the trail, like someone had stood and watched for a while. They weren't mine. The tread was different. Narrow heel, shallow depth, probably lighter than me. The prints turned away and vanished into the underbrush. I circled the area for nearly an hour, heart pounding, rifle ready. Nothing. No sign of anyone. No noise. No movement. I didn't hunt that day. I stayed close to the cabin, splitting wood, keeping an eye on the tree line. I tried to tell myself it was just some backpacker or off-grid hermit, but that didn't explain the axe, or the way he moved, or the tracks near the cabin. That night, just after midnight, I heard something outside. It wasn't an animal. I know the difference. I've camped my whole life. This was careful, slow movement, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. I sat up in bed, my heart thudding, and grabbed the rifle. Then I heard it, a quiet tap, wood against wood. Then again, a little closer. It sounded like someone lightly hitting a tree. Tap, tap, silence. I didn't breathe for a full minute. I sat there with the rifle pointed at the door, listening so hard my ears rang. Then, nothing, just wind. I stayed like that until the stove went cold and the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I stepped outside, everything looked normal. No tracks, no signs, just frost on the ground and birds starting to move in the trees. I made up my mind right then. I was done. I packed my gear, loaded my food, and made a plan to leave the next morning. I didn't want to hike out at night. Whatever was going on out here, I didn't want to be a part of it. That last day, I didn't leave the cabin. I sat with my back to the wall, rifle beside me, watching the tree line. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that maybe this was all just coincidence. But I knew better. You don't end up this far off-grid by accident. Around sunset, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't subtle. Crunching in the leaves, maybe 30 feet out. Slow footsteps like someone circling. I stood up, rifle ready, and crept to the window. Through the trees, I saw movement. A man. He was standing still, half hidden behind a tree. He wasn't looking at me, but I could see his face. Beard, weathered skin, dark eyes locked on the cabin. He held something in his hand, not the axe this time. Looked like a metal pipe or a crowbar. I raised the rifle and aimed through the window, but I didn't fire. I just watched. He didn't move, didn't even flinch. Then he turned and walked away, slowly, into the woods. I stayed up the entire night. When the sun rose, I didn't waste a second. I strapped my gear on, loaded everything I could carry, and started hiking back to the truck. I didn't care about the rest. I just wanted out. That walk back felt longer than the whole trip put together. Every noise made me flinch. I checked behind me every 5 minutes, convinced I'd see that man following. But I didn't. The truck was just where I left it. Thank God. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and didn't look back. I drove straight to a gas station in Kalispell, shaking the whole way. I called the local sheriff's office and told them everything. About the man, the tracks, the sounds. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I never heard back. I haven't gone back since. A month later, I read a short article online. Unidentified remains found in remote Montana forest. It was vague. Just a hiker, found decomposed near a ravine not far from where I stayed. No ID. No foul play confirmed. Just another mystery in the woods. I think about that man a lot. The way he moved, the way he stood behind the tree and watched. Whoever he was, he wasn't just passing through. He knew that forest. He had a plan. And I believe with every bone in my body that if I hadn't left that morning, something terrible would have happened. It wasn't a ghost story. It wasn't some movie villain. It was just a man, real, dangerous, and too close. And that's what still scares me, because it can happen out there, where no one can hear you scream, where nobody even knows you're gone. It wasn't some evil spirit or ancient curse. It was worse. It was real. I had just turned 35 the summer I decided to take a long break from work. After working 10 years as a surveyor in Manchester, I finally burned out. Everything about the city started feeling loud and gray. My sleep was bad, my appetite worse, and I felt like I couldn't even breathe properly unless I was outside of that concrete mess. I needed quiet.
Proper quiet.
I didn't want another trip to a tourist-heavy countryside bed and breakfast. I wanted complete stillness. No service.
Nos chaps.
Just quiet. So in mid-August of 2022, I booked a week in a privately owned cabin up in Northumberland, near the Scottish border. It was in the Cheviot Hills, not far from a village called Ingram. You could only get there with a four-wheel drive, and the owner had to give me detailed instructions through email because Google Maps just gave up halfway. It was perfect. 1 bedroom, solar power for lights, a small gas heater, a well behind the property for water, and a wood stove. No internet. No electricity aside from the basics. It was buried in trees and shrubs, maybe 5 miles away from the nearest village. I was told not to expect anyone to be nearby. The land was private and the cabin was the only structure within a few miles radius. I was warned about deer and maybe the odd fox, but that was it. I arrived on a Monday in the late afternoon. The drive had been rough, and I scraped the bottom of my car more than once going over rocks and washed out tracks. But the moment I stepped out and saw the valley, the hills, the quiet, it all felt worth it. You could hear the wind pushing through grass and leaves like waves. No traffic, no phones, no emails. I spent the first night just unwinding. I unpacked my bag, set up the small radio I brought, cooked myself some tin stew on the gas hob, and lit a small fire in the stove. The night came on quickly and it got cold, but I liked it. I'd forgotten how black the sky got without streetlights, and how loud nature could be when you weren't used to it. Crickets, wind, creaks from the wood frame. I read for a bit by the little lamp and then slept hard. The next day, I hiked around the area. I followed a narrow, barely there trail up a ridge and then walked along a field edge. I didn't see anyone or anything besides birds and trees. The air smelled clean. That was the first day I felt like I could really breathe again. I got back to the cabin just before it got dark. I made pasta, wrote in my journal, and went to sleep early. On the third day, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything big, just small things that I wrote off at the time. I was eating a late lunch on the small porch when I thought I saw something move between the trees, down the hill to the east of the cabin. Just a flicker, a shape that passed between the trunks. I stared for a while, but nothing else moved. I assumed it was a deer or something like that. They were supposed to be everywhere around here. I shook it off. Later that night, around midnight, I went outside to use the loo. I had to walk around the side of the cabin to this old compost toilet the owner had set up. It was pitch black and freezing, but I had a headlamp on. When I came back, I thought I saw a faint reflection off glass down the hill, maybe 50 yards into the woods, like a small light catching on a lens or a window, but I couldn't see clearly. I stared for a while and then went back inside. On Thursday, I noticed footprints. It had rained the night before, and the ground was muddy. I was walking toward the back of the cabin, toward the well when I saw them. They weren't mine. I always wore hiking boots, and these were smaller, more narrow, and barefoot. The prints were clear. The toes showed, a full arch. They had come up from the trees, circled near the back wall of the cabin, and then returned the same way. They looked fresh. The water hadn't filled them in. I felt a chill but didn't panic. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal? But no animal makes clean, human-shaped footprints like that. Still, I didn't want to overthink it. I didn't feel unsafe yet. That afternoon, I walked further down the hill in the direction of the prints, just to settle my nerves. I figured maybe a wild camper or a shepherd had been nearby. The land was marked as private, but it wasn't impossible for someone to wander through. I didn't find anything. No tents, no litter, no signs of people. But I did find something else. There was a tree stump, maybe a foot high, and on top of it were 3 feathers tied together with what looked like a bit of old shoelace. It had been placed carefully, not dropped, deliberately arranged. That made the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was wrong. Too intentional. I left it alone and went back to the cabin. That night, I locked the door and propped a chair against it. The next morning, I noticed a smell. It was faint, sour, and earthy, like rotting leaves or spoiled meat. I thought maybe an animal had died under the cabin. I circled the building, crouched low, and tried to look underneath, but I couldn't see anything. I tried to ignore it. By lunch, the smell was gone. But later that day, when I opened the storage cupboard near the bed, I found something tucked into the far corner on the floor. It was a rabbit's foot, cleanly severed. The fur was matted with dried blood. It was resting on a bit of folded cloth I didn't recognize. It hadn't been there when I unpacked. I would have seen it. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself that maybe I missed it. But I knew I didn't. That was when I started getting properly nervous. I checked all the windows and doors. They were locked. I looked through my bag, trying to remember if the owner said anyone else used the cabin regularly. They hadn't. This was supposed to be isolated. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 1 a.m., I heard crunching in the leaves outside. Slow, soft, like careful footsteps. I turned off the light and pressed my ear to the wooden wall. Nothing for a minute. Then the crunch again. Closer. Then a scrape, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I didn't move. I held my breath. Then a sound like fingernails, dragging slowly across the wall outside, just beneath the window. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had decided to leave early. I had 2 days left, but I'd had enough. I packed everything quickly, barely ate. I felt exposed the whole time, like I was being watched. I kept the door locked while I loaded the car. But when I stepped outside one last time to grab firewood to return to the bin, I saw her. Up the slope, just at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 yards away, there was a woman standing completely still. Pale skin, thin frame. She wore what looked like an old, mud-stained dress that clung to her legs. Her hair was long and dark and hung over one side of her face. She wasn't moving, just watching. I froze. She didn't wave, didn't call out, didn't take a step, just stared at me with her head slightly tilted. I backed up slowly, went back inside, and locked the door. I waited a full hour. When I looked again through the small back window, she was gone. I drove out fast, tearing down that rough track, scraping rocks and sliding in mud. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I didn't look back. That night, in a roadside motel, I emailed the cabin owner and told them what happened. I asked if anyone else lived on the land. They didn't reply. Not that week. Not ever. The listing disappeared a few days later. I filed a report with the local police just in case. They sent someone out, but I never heard anything back. They probably thought I imagined it or had a run-in with a squatter. But I know what I saw. It's been 2 years since that trip. I haven't gone camping alone again. I still have dreams where I see her, still and silent at the edge of trees, waiting. But what sticks with me most isn't the way she looked. It's the feeling I got when I saw her. That cold certainty that she wasn't surprised to see me, like she'd been watching me the whole time, like she knew I would be there, like I was the one who wasn't supposed to be there at all. I was 32 when I decided to spend a week alone at a remote cabin in the mountains of North Carolina. It was September 2021. I'd been living in Raleigh for about 4 years, working long hours as a freelance software developer, and I'd hit the point where I needed to just unplug from everything. No cell service, no emails, no people. I wanted space. I didn't want to see a single soul for days. Looking back, that wish came true in the worst way. The cabin I booked through an obscure local listing site wasn't the usual Airbnb kind of place. It was older, probably built in the 1970s, tucked way up near the Pisgah National Forest boundary, just outside a small town called Lakeview. The owner was an older guy named Frank who only communicated through short email replies. He gave me coordinates, not an address, and told me to bring everything I needed for the week, including firewood, water, and a battery pack for electricity. I didn't mind. That kind of off-grid setup was exactly what I wanted. The drive from Raleigh took about 6 hours. I left around noon and made it there by early evening. The last 2 hours were all mountain roads. Sharp turns, no shoulder, cliffs on one side and dense forest on the other. I passed maybe 2 houses on the final stretch. When I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, I had to slow down to about 5 miles per hour. Trees pressed in on both sides. The road hadn't been graded in a long time. There were ruts deep enough to scrape the underside of my Subaru if I wasn't careful. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked exactly how I expected. Weathered dark wood, sagging front porch, old chimney rising above the peaked roof. There was a metal sign nailed to a tree that said, Jackson Hollow. I backed the car in and sat there for a minute before turning it off, just listening to the quiet. No traffic.
No dogs barking.
No people. I unpacked quickly, 2 jugs of water, dried food, instant coffee, 2 coolers, a stack of paperbacks, and some tools. I had a hatchet, a folding saw, and a pocket knife. I also had a bolt-action rifle I inherited from my uncle, loaded with a full magazine. I brought it more for peace of mind than anything. I wasn't hunting, just camping, but I didn't like the idea of being that far out without protection. The cabin had a single room, with stove in one corner, small cot along one wall.
No Escalation.
No electricity, aside from a solar-powered lantern I brought. The place smelled like pine, smoke, and something older, something like mouse droppings or damp wood. I checked every drawer and every corner for anything weird. There wasn't much. A few dusty pots, a cracked mirror over a wooden table, a map of the surrounding forest tacked to the wall, yellowed with age. The first night passed quietly. I stayed up late, reading by lantern, with a small fire crackling in the stove. I fell asleep sometime after midnight, bundled in my sleeping bag on the cot, listening to the wind outside tapping through the trees. It rained lightly overnight. I remember waking up briefly around 3 a.m. to the sound of water dripping off the roof. Nothing else. The next morning, I walked the area. The forest behind the cabin stretched for miles. I brought the rifle with me out of habit, not expecting to see much. I spotted a few deer trails and some older boot prints heading northeast, probably from a hunter. I marked the direction with a few sticks so I wouldn't lose the cabin on the way back. I spent most of the day splitting wood, boiling water for coffee, and reading. Around dusk, I spotted a light in the woods. It was faint, orange like firelight, maybe a few hundred yards through the trees to the north. I thought it might have been another camper or hunter with a fire going. It didn't seem odd at first. But what made me uneasy was that I hadn't seen a single car or person since leaving the main road, and the trail that went that direction was overgrown, like it hadn't been used in months. Still, I told myself not to overthink it. I kept the cabin fire small and turned off my lantern early. That night, something moved outside. I heard branches snap, slow, deliberate cracks like someone walking carefully. I sat up in bed and held my breath.
No footsteps.
No animal sounds, just a soft crunch every few seconds. I didn't have a watch, but I guessed it was around 2 a.m. The wind was still.
No rain.
Total silence otherwise. I stayed frozen, listening. Then came a tap. Not on the door, but on the far wall of the cabin. Just one soft tap, like someone pressing their finger against the wood. Then nothing. I picked up the rifle, eased out of the cot, and stood next to the stove. I didn't turn on the lantern. I didn't make a sound. I stayed there for what must have been an hour, muscles tense, listening to every creak and whisper outside. Eventually, I heard retreating footsteps, fast, uneven crunches, moving back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. I didn't find any footprints or signs of an animal. The ground was damp, so anything that had stepped there should have left something behind. But there was nothing, just pine needles, wet dirt, and silence. I kept the rifle close that day. No more exploring. I stayed near the cabin, chopping wood and constantly scanning the trees. I left the fire burning all day. It helped with the nerves, but not much. Just before sunset, I saw movement near the same patch of woods where I'd seen the orange light the night before. This time, it wasn't fire. It was a person. Definitely a man, wearing a dark jacket and standing half-hidden behind a tree. He wasn't moving, just standing. I watched him from the porch. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't wave. I didn't speak. After about 10 seconds, he turned and disappeared into the trees. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going and sat on the floor with my back to the wall, rifle across my lap, waiting for something to happen. Every noise outside made me grip the stock harder. I kept imagining that face staring through the window, but it never came. At some point around dawn, I dozed off. When I woke up, it was daylight and I was freezing. The fire had gone out. My hands were stiff. My lower back ached from sitting on the hard floor. I knew I had to leave. I packed as fast as I could. Everything went into the Subaru, and I started the engine with shaking hands. I took one last look at the cabin, half expecting to see the man in the woods again. But the trees were still. The drive back down the dirt road was brutal. Every pothole felt like it would snap my axle. At one point, I had to stop and clear a small fallen tree with my hatchet. It took 15 minutes, but I didn't want to leave the car. I kept scanning the woods, waiting to see movement. I never did. By the time I reached the main road, my nerves were shot. I didn't relax until I hit the highway. I didn't stop for gas. I didn't eat. I just kept driving. Back in Raleigh, I stayed in my apartment for 3 days straight. I couldn't sleep without waking up in a panic. I kept checking the windows. I kept expecting to hear a tap on the wall. I emailed the owner, Frank, and told him about the man I saw. He never replied. I looked up the listing again a few weeks later, and it was gone. The website had shut down. I couldn't find a trace of it. I even checked Google Maps using the coordinates I saved. The cabin wasn't visible in satellite view. Too many trees. I'll never know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just a squatter or someone living off-grid. Maybe he was watching me the whole time, waiting for me to sleep. But what sticks with me, what still messes with my head, is how quiet he was. No broken twigs. No footsteps until he wanted me to hear them. Just one soft tap on the wall. I still dream about that sound.